Biological intelligence is not a spiritual entity. Chapter 1. Introduction: The Myth of the Spiritual Nature of Intelligence. Briefly on why many people attribute a spiritual or mystical basis to intelligence. Many people perceive intelligence as something beyond biology because the process of thinking seems mysterious and inexplicable. We cannot directly see the work of neurons or chemical processes in the brain, but we can be aware of thoughts, emotions, and memories. This creates the illusion that consciousness exists independently of the body, as a separate immaterial entity. In addition, people tend to give special significance to phenomena they do not understand. When inner experiences seem incomprehensible, there is a temptation to explain them through concepts like soul, spirit, or higher energy, which fits easily into a worldview where humans are seen as unique creations rather than as products of natural evolution. Historical and cultural roots of this misconception. The idea of the spiritual nature of the mind has deep historical roots. In ancient cultures, explanations for any complex phenomena were built on mythology and religion. Ancient philosophers and priests, lacking scientific knowledge about the brain, assumed that the mind was a gift from the gods or a manifestation of an immaterial life force. In antiquity, Plato considered the soul the source of thought, with the body as merely a temporary vessel. In the Middle Ages, religious doctrines reinforced the idea of the mind as part of the immortal soul that governs the body. These ideas were passed down through generations and became part of cultural traditions, woven into art, literature, and education. Even with the development of science and the emergence of neurophysiology, many people continued and continue to rely on outdated spiritual interpretations because they are emotionally appealing and align with familiar worldview frameworks. Chapter 2. Defining biological intelligence. Intelligence as a product of evolution and the functioning of the nervous system. Biological intelligence is the result of a long evolutionary process in which living organisms developed nervous systems for more effective interaction with their environment. In primitive creatures, the nervous system was limited to simple reflex reactions, but as environments and social interactions became more complex, animals began to develop structures capable of analyzing information, predicting events, and making decisions. Human intelligence represents the peak of this process at the current stage of evolution. It is based on the functioning of the brain, which consists of billions of neurons forming complex networks. The transmission of signals between neurons through electrical impulses and chemical mediators creates the activity we perceive as thoughts, memory, and consciousness. Thus, intelligence is not an abstract energy, but a concrete function of a living organism, dependent on its physiological state and the structure of the brain. The difference between intelligence and the soul, or spirit, in religious and esoteric views. In religious and esoteric traditions, it is often claimed that the mind is a manifestation of an immaterial soul or spirit that exists outside physical laws and continues life after the death of the body. Within these belief systems, intelligence is not regarded as a product of biology, but is perceived as part of an eternal, divine, or cosmic essence. The scientific approach is entirely opposite. Intelligence depends on the functioning of the brain and disappears when the brain is destroyed. Damage to specific brain regions due to injuries, strokes, or diseases leads to the loss of memory, skills, and even the ability to reason, something that cannot be explained if the mind is considered to exist independently of the body. Unlike a soul, intelligence does not possess independent existence. It cannot leave the body or function separately from the biological structure that supports it. This makes it part of the material world rather than a supernatural reality. Chapter 3. Evolutionary Reasons for the Emergence of Intelligence. Intelligence as a tool for survival, not for grasping higher truths. Evolution shaped intelligence not for the pursuit of abstract truth, but for solving practical problems related to survival. The ability to analyze situations, predict the consequences of actions, and learn from experience provided a direct advantage in the struggle for resources and safety. For our distant ancestors, the ability to find food, avoid predators, build shelters, and cooperate within a group was far more important than philosophical reflections on the nature of the universe. Even modern human cognitive abilities that allow us to create science and art are byproducts of adaptive mechanisms rather than a purposeful gift intended for the discovery of absolute truths. In other words, intelligence is a biological tool, refined by millions of years of natural selection for effective orientation within reality, not for transcending it. Examples from the animal world demonstrating that reason is not a uniquely human phenomenon. Intelligent behavior is observed in many animal species, which refutes the myth that intelligence belongs exclusively to humans. Crows and parrots are able to use available objects as tools and solve multi-step problems. Dolphins display complex social interaction and learn new behaviors through imitation. Primates, such as chimpanzees and orangutans, are capable of creating simple tools, transmitting knowledge across generations, and applying strategic thinking during hunting. Even some species of octopus show ingenuity, for example, using coconut shells as protective shelters. These examples demonstrate that problem solving and the ability to adapt to new situations are not uniquely human traits, but the result of shared evolutionary mechanisms. Human intelligence is more advanced both quantitatively and qualitatively, yet it remains a continuation of the natural line of cognitive development rather than a separate miracle or mystical phenomenon. Chapter 4, The Neurophysiology of Thinking. The role of neural connections, chemical processes, and sensory input. Thinking is the result of a complex interaction among billions of neurons connected by synapses. Each neuron transmits signals through electrical impulses, while information exchange between them is regulated by neurotransmitters, chemical substances such as dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, and others. These chemical processes determine reaction speed, levels of attention, emotional states, and the capacity for learning. Sensory systems, vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste, supply the brain with information from the external world. This data is processed in specialized areas of the cerebral cortex, integrated, and forms an internal model of reality. Without this constant influx of data, intelligence is deprived of the primary material needed for analysis and decision-making. Thus, thinking does not arise in a vacuum. It always relies on the physiological functioning of the nervous system and the continuous exchange of signals between the brain and the sensory organs. Why thoughts and consciousness are biological functions rather than manifestations of some immaterial entity. Thoughts and consciousness are not autonomous phenomena existing separately from the body, but processes that arise due to the physical activity of the brain. Neurophysiological research shows that any change in the brain's structure or chemical balance, injury, illness, or the influence of psychoactive substances directly affects the content and quality of thought. If consciousness were immaterial and independent, such changes should not affect it. The brain can be viewed as a complex biological computer in which electrical and chemical signals generate subjective experience. Even complex phenomena such as self-awareness or creativity can be traced to the activity of specific brain regions. This means that a spiritual explanation of thinking is redundant. Everything we call the mind fits within the framework of biological processes governed by the laws of physics and chemistry. Chapter 5. Errors of the Spiritual Interpretation of Intelligence. Illusions arising from limited self-observation. Human intelligence is capable of observing and analyzing its own activity, but this observation is incomplete and fragmented. We do not see the work of our neurons, we do not feel electrical impulses, and we do not perceive the chemical reactions that underlie thoughts and emotions. As a result, an impression arises that consciousness is something independent, not dependent on the material nature of the brain. In addition, subjective experience appears internally coherent and continuous, even though it is actually formed from a vast number of discrete processes. This coherence is a product of the brain's integration of scattered signals into a unified picture, yet it is perceived by the individual as a manifestation of a spiritual or immaterial essence. Cognitive biases that lead us to attribute an immaterial nature to ourselves. Many people are subject to cognitive biases that reinforce belief in the immaterial nature of the mind. One of these is intuitive dualism. in which a person automatically divides the world into the physical and the mental, perceiving thoughts as existing outside of matter. Another is the illusion of control, where the subjective feeling of free will is taken as evidence of independence from biological mechanisms. Personalization of experience also plays a strong role. We feel that our inner world is unique and irreproducible, which easily leads to the idea of its special higher origin. Confirmation bias is also at work. The tendency to notice and remember only those facts that align with existing beliefs, including belief in a spiritual essence of consciousness. These biases are natural to human thinking, but they distort the true nature of intelligence, preventing us from seeing its biological foundation. Chapter 6: The Role of Emotions and Instincts. How the emotional sphere, also biological in nature, shapes worldview. Emotions are the result of the functioning of ancient brain regions, such as the limbic system, and they serve as tools for rapid evaluation of situations. Joy, fear, anger, surprise, all of these are biological reactions that help in making decisions without prolonged analysis. They are formed on the basis of innate mechanisms in individual experience, influencing how a person perceives the world. The emotional sphere is directly connected to intelligence. It determines priorities, amplifies or weakens attention, guides memory, and shapes motivation. A person's worldview is always colored by their emotional state. For example, an anxious individual perceives more threats than opportunities in their surroundings, while an inspired one tends to see the opposite. Since emotions are part of our biological nature, they are governed by the same bodily laws as intelligence and are not manifestations of any higher or immaterial force. Examples of manipulations that exploit spiritual illusions: the illusion of a spiritual nature of the mind is actively used in religious, political, and commercial manipulation. One example is the promise of eternal life or higher enlightenment in exchange for submission to certain rules and dogmas. This exploits the fear of death and the desire for significance, both of which are directly linked to the biological instinct of self-preservation. Another example involves claims of karmic retribution or energetic cleansing, which exploit feelings of guilt and the desire for control over one's fate. Individuals are led to believe that their inner world is directly connected to invisible forces, and that certain actions or purchases, courses, amulets, rituals, will help them achieve spiritual perfection. Such manipulations work precisely because they engage basic emotions and instincts, fear, hope, and the desire to belong to a group, rather than because they rely on any real immaterial phenomena. Chapter 7: The Dangers of the Myth of a Spiritual Essence. Loss of critical thinking. Belief in the spiritual nature of intelligence often weakens a person's ability to critically analyze information. When someone accepts the idea of an immaterial, higher part of themselves without examining evidence, they tend to extend this approach to other areas of thinking as well. As a result, claims supported by authority or emotional appeal begin to be perceived as truth without the need for proof. Critical thinking requires verifying sources, evaluating the logic of arguments, and comparing facts, whereas the myth of a spiritual essence of consciousness fosters the opposite habit, taking wishful thinking for reality. This makes a person more dependent on their own beliefs and emotions than on objective data. Increased vulnerability to religious, political, and commercial propaganda. Those who are convinced of a special spiritual nature of their mind easily become targets for manipulation. Religious organizations may promise salvation or higher knowledge in exchange for loyalty. Political forces may claim that their ideology represents the true path of human development, and commercial entities may sell products and services that supposedly enhance spiritual energy or purify consciousness. In all these cases, individuals are influenced because they treat the proposed ideas not as testable hypotheses, but as truths grounded in the special nature of their consciousness. This weakens their defenses against deception and makes them dependent on external authorities that claim the right to interpret spiritual truths on their behalf. Chapter 8: Scientific Understanding and the Advantages of a Clear-Eyed View. How a materialist understanding of intelligence helps develop self-control. A materialist approach views intelligence as a function of the brain and behavior as the result of interactions among neurophysiological processes, emotions, and external factors. This understanding allows a person to consciously influence their reactions, manage impulses, and adjust behavior. When we understand that emotions and thoughts have a biological basis, we stop perceiving them as something uncontrollable or sent from above. This opens the possibility of training attention, developing critical thinking, using cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, and applying other scientifically grounded methods to improve mental well-being. Thus, abandoning mystical notions of intelligence turns self-control from an abstract idea into a practical skill that can be developed systematically and predictably. Opportunities for improving life and adaptation in the age of technology. A clear-eyed understanding of intelligence as a biological system makes it possible to adapt more effectively to a rapidly changing world. In the technological era, individuals face information overload, complex social structures, and new forms of interaction with artificial intelligence. A materialist perspective helps filter information, assess risks, and make rational decisions without relying on emotional or mystical interpretations. This approach also supports personal growth. We can objectively assess our strengths and weaknesses, plan skill development, and adapt behavioral strategies. In the long term, it increases resilience to stress, improves quality of life, and allows us to use scientific and technological advances for our benefit rather than becoming victims of manipulation or our own illusions. Chapter 9, Conclusion: Recognizing Oneself as Biological Intelligence. Why abandoning spiritual illusions does not impoverish but liberates thinking. Rejecting the idea that intelligence is a spiritual or mystical entity does not deprive a person of meaning or values. On the contrary, it removes the constraints imposed by religious and esoteric concepts and allows one to see the world as it is, without the filter of dogmas and myths. Awareness of our biological nature helps us perceive thoughts and emotions as processes that can be managed, rather than as external messages or manifestations of supernatural forces. This frees thinking from fear of inevitable destinies and from dependence on authorities who claim to possess true knowledge. Freedom from spiritual illusions makes it possible to build life on the basis of facts, logic, and personal experience, rather than on belief in unverified concepts. Prospects for personal and societal development. On an individual level, understanding oneself as a biological intelligence opens the path to self-improvement. A person can develop cognitive skills, strengthen emotional resilience, and rationally manage resources of time and energy. This approach enables the deliberate formation of healthy habits, effective behavioral strategies, and adaptive skills. On a societal level, abandoning the myth of a spiritual essence of intelligence promotes a culture that values evidence-based reasoning, the scientific method, and critical thinking. This creates a foundation for more responsible decision-making in politics, economics, education, and technology. In the long run, such a worldview can reduce the level of manipulation, increase society's resilience to propaganda, and stimulate the development of science that serves real human needs, rather than sustaining illusions.